Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hi, and here we are again, Fahrusha. Another day and another show.
Yes, and we have a very exciting show today.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Let's slate.
Oh, okay.
Today is July 25th, 2017, and it is our 52nd show. Can you believe that?
No, really. No.
I really don't either. I mean, it's gone by like a flash, and I think it's because we've had a bunch of really interesting people on, and today does not disappoint. I am really proud and honored to have as our guest today the laboratory manager of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the PEAR Lab. Miss Brenda Dunne is with us today. She worked with Dr. Robert Jahn and still does. He was the Dean Emeritus of Princeton School of Engineering and Applied Science, and he is the Professor Emeritus of Aerospace Engineering. After the lab closed in 2007, they moved their operation to a nonprofit organization called the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, or ICRL. They also have ICRL Press, which publishes books on consciousness, science, and spirituality, including a book called Molecular Memories, a book by Brenda Dunne and Dr. Robert Jahn, which we will discuss today amongst other things. And now, without further ado, we shall welcome Brenda Dunne.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm really quite impressed. Fahrusha was telling me about you and the work that's being done at PEAR. And I really congratulate you on being a pioneer. It takes a lot of courage to be a pioneer.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Could you tell us something about PEAR? I mean, just a lot of people are unfamiliar with the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, and I think it's important that it be brought to public attention.
Okay. The PEAR Lab was established by Professor Jahn in 1979, at which time he was the Dean of Princeton School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And he became interested in the topic of human-machine anomalies through a project, an undergraduate project that he supervised. This young woman had read some of the studies that had been done where people seemed to be able to affect random event generators without any sensory contact, just through their consciousness. And although he was a bit skeptical at the time, he did believe that the design and construction of a random event generator and the design and conduct of a research experiment associated with it was a reasonable undergraduate project. So he did supervise it, and as a result, the project got some very interesting findings that suggested that people could indeed influence the random output of these devices. He became quite interested even after the student lost interest, and believed that these phenomena had important engineering implications. You know, at the time, engineering technology was just booming, and they were becoming more and more dependent on sensitive random processes in various forms of applications. So he, as an aerospace engineer, he was also familiar with Mr. James McDonnell, the patriarch of the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company. who it turned out also had an interest in the topic, and in particular had some concerns about the vulnerability of some of the sensitive cockpit instrumentation to the emotional reactions of the pilot. It turns out that Mr. McDonnell was also a Princeton graduate, and at a meeting that they both had attended, he suggested to Bob Jahn that he set up a program to study this topic more carefully, and that if he would do so, he would be glad to support it financially. Well, after further conversation, Bob agreed to do it and started talking to his administration, who weren't too happy about the idea. But given Bob's position as an administrative officer of the university and his tenured position as a professor, they finally agreed to let him do it, with a number of caveats. It was not to be an academic program, simply a research project, no teaching, no student activity, and so forth. Given Bob's other major commitments, he needed somebody to manage the laboratory on a day-to-day basis. And he went, looking for somebody who could fulfill that role. In particular, he wanted somebody who came from a different perspective than his own, preferably a woman, because he felt that it needed a yin component to his yang, if you will. Mm-hmm. Somebody who was sensitive to people and so forth. And he attended a meeting of the Parapsychological Association in the summer of 1978, where I was giving a talk describing some of my early studies in remote viewing. Remote viewing is an experiment where people attempt to describe some distant location without any sensory input, and to see if they could describe it just by thinking about it. During one of the coffee breaks, we met, and he told me that he was interested in starting a program at Princeton. He asked if I would be interested in working with him, and needless to say, I thought it was a fantastic idea. I was at a point in my life where I was in graduate school at the time with another year to go, but had been recently divorced, had sold my house, was not quite sure what I wanted to do with the rest of my life, and this was just an opportunity, that descended from heaven. So we talked a bit. We discussed the potential of the program, and in the fall he offered me the position. The university was a bit uncomfortable with the idea of having someone with a psychology degree managing an engineering research program, but they finally did capitulate. And I moved to Princeton in the following spring, in June of '79, and we started the PEAR program.
Would it be fair to say that the work at the PEAR Lab was groundbreaking, and it brought psi research to physics and ushered in a new era of psi research as a result of it?
Probably. It certainly was groundbreaking. Although most of the research that we did there, it was based on replicating the work of others. The remote viewing work that was being done at SRI, mm-hmm. and some of the human-machine anomalies that were being conducted by people like physicist Helmut Schmidt, uh-huh. who I believe at the time was working for Boeing. I could be wrong on that. He did work there at one time. But the program basically had three components. One of them, and probably the major one, was a body of experiments in what we called human-machine anomalies, where people, ordinary people, not people who claimed unusual abilities, just ordinary volunteers, would interact with a random system of some sort, and we had quite a few of them. Some of them were microelectronic, some of them were macroscopic mechanical devices, etc. We had probably 5 or 6 different random processes, but each of them produced some kind of random output, some sequence of random binary bits. And the operators, as we called them, we didn't call them subjects because we weren't studying the people. We were studying the machines, basically. And where these operators would attempt to influence the output of these devices in accordance with a pre-stated and pre-recorded intention. Usually, the experiments followed what we called a tripolar protocol, where the people would generate data under an intention to try to produce higher numbers, or if you want more ones, more bits, or a negative intention where they tried to get more lower numbers or more zeros, and a baseline where they just stayed in the same place and just didn't think anything and let the machine do its own thing. Those I'll go back and describe, the results of those, but we collected, many millions, or probably tens of millions of data points in these experiments over the years. The other part of the program was a study of remote perception, remote viewing. We called it remote perception because it seemed to us that the phenomenon wasn't necessarily a visual one. Where, as I said before, people would attempt to describe some remote location that was assigned randomly, and where another person would visit at a predetermined time. Our concern in these experiments really was to develop a more systematic measure of quantification of the results. Instead of having some third party attempt to match the perceptions and the targets, to see how well they matched, we wanted something that took the third person out, and it was a more, as I said, quantitative measurement of the amount of information that was acquired. In that experimental program, we collected over 650 trials over the years, again, with very significant results. The third part of the program basically addressed the question of what in the world is going on here, namely an attempt to design some sort of a model that could accommodate these anomalous phenomena and explain what was going on. I can't say we were ever fully successful in that regard, but we did come up with some ideas and some models that we published in our papers and books.
It might be a good time to mention a couple of those books, The Margins of Reality and Consciousness and the Source of Reality.
Okay, well, let's see. Margins of Reality, subtitled The Role of Consciousness in the Physical World, was published in 1987, I believe, 87 or 87. And it described the program to date, the results, the design of experiments, some of the theoretical ideas, and the implications of these phenomena for a variety of areas, whether it be engineering or psychology or medicine or, a lot of them. Consciousness and the Source of Reality, subtitled The PEAR Odyssey, was actually not published until 2000. Oh gosh, I'm blocking on the date.
But
I think it was 2000.
Later, though.
Yes,
later.
It was after the lab closed.
Yeah.
And
so after 2007, we would say.
Yes, I'm trying to check that out. I don't. I have a copy of the book here, but it doesn't.
That's okay.
have
I
the
don't
date.
think that's
2000,
essential.
Yeah.
2001. No, 2011.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Okay. And that was really a sequel to Margins of Reality that covered some of the same material, but now covered the full 28-year history of the program, as opposed to just the first 8 years, and covered, some other areas that we had not thought of, at that early time. In particular, as the title suggests, we had become persuaded that what we were really studying here was human consciousness. Consciousness not as a epiphenomenon of the brain, as a lot of people, were proposing, but consciousness as something greater, something that was associated with what we refer to as the source. However one wants to describe that, the Akashic record, the 0-point field, the ki or chi or prana, etc. But the big source with a capital S.
Can I make a comment in here, because I having read having read all of Molecular Memories, which is one of your recent books, I came to the conclusion that essentially it seemed to me what PEAR did is to take the statements about the fundamental issues role of consciousness that have been made by quantum physicists like Max Planck and many others, and then turn them into replicable engineering experiments. And I wanted to say that it's my view that many technicians use quantum physics for practical ends, such as advanced computers and a lot of the gadgets we use today, but they are very challenged to comprehend their impact on 4D physical reality and the primacy of consciousness. So
exactly.
We often hear the phrase, shut up and calculate, referring to this apparent schism in thought in the technicians who are mechanistic materialists but use quantum physics in their work.
Yeah, that's quite correct. In fact, a fourth book that we published was called Quirks of the Quantum Mind. It actually described one of our theoretical approaches in which we pointed out that if one looked closely at the principles underlying quantum mechanics, one could detect, in a sense, a projection of the activity of consciousness. And one could draw a very interesting and fun parallel between these various principles or ideas and the psychology, of the human mind. In fact, because I had no background myself in advanced physics, I didn't even have a background in introductory physics, to be frank, when we first started. But Bob had suggested that I sit in on a class he was teaching at a graduate level on quantum mechanics. And he told me, he said, don't worry about the math and, the various, just listen to the principles, the ideas that are being presented. And so I was sitting in on that class that was comprised of graduate students, mostly engineers or physicists. And one day, one of the students said to me, "Say, aren't you a psychologist?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Why are you taking a class on quantum mechanics?" And I looked at him in mock amazement, and I said, "Quantum mechanics? Gosh, I thought this was a course on the psychology of subatomic particles."
Good one.
Which, in a sense, was the idea. But when we first came up with this model, or metaphor, if you will, we thought it would be interesting to see what some of the patriarchs of quantum mechanics had to say on the topic. And we did some pretty heavy background research looking at all of their They're more philosophical writings, not the technical ones. And we looked at the writings of people like Niels Bohr or Max Planck or Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Albert Einstein, a whole slew. I'm probably leaving some out. But to our amazement, what we discovered was that virtually every one of them acknowledged that what they were looking at had to involve the role of consciousness. Now, they came up, among them were Erwin Schrödinger of the Schrödinger equation that virtually every physicist and engineer uses in the course of their daily activities. But although they used the equation, none of them had read any of Schrödinger's philosophical writings in which he maintained that what was going on was consciousness, the activity of consciousness. So anyway, we prepared a very extensive appendix to our book, which I think I mentioned was called Quirks of the Quantum Mind, that relayed all of these comments by all of these well-regarded early physicists and the founders, really, of quantum mechanical theory. So I think I've kind of gotten off my track.
No, it's very interesting.
Now, you were talking about your book, Quirks. And
although Margins of Reality had originally been published by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, Harcourt went out of business, and the book was going out of print. And it was in about 2009 or 10, we spoke with a colleague who was in the publishing business, and he proposed that we establish a publishing imprint that we called the ICRL Press. It's a subsidiary, if you will, of ICRL. And we've published so far, I think, 13 books that deal with various aspects, as you pointed out, of consciousness, science, and spirituality. 4 of those books are our own that we mentioned: Margins, Consciousness and the Source of Reality, Quirks of the Quantum Mind, and Molecular Memories. And in addition to that, we've published a number of other fascinating books that deal with these topics by other authors. There is if you or your listeners go to the ICRL webpage, it's icrl.org, you can go to ICRL Press and see a catalog of all of these books. They range from a collection of creation myths from different cultures to a review of the philosophy of Spinoza, to essays on the nature of the relationship of the human mind and nature, etc. A couple of others, but they're all, if I say so myself, fascinating books. We have 3 more at the moment that are in preparation. Cool. So basically, we're putting the majority of our efforts these days into the publishing area. We've stopped doing any research a couple of years ago. It was getting to the point where there was really nothing else to say. We didn't want to do more of what we'd already done. That we thought it was more important to encourage other people to carry on that work and look in other dimensions of the phenomena that we were not able to do while we were at the university.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, you've done such phenomenal, groundbreaking work. I would assume that someone was going to pick up the baton and carry on, no?
Yes, there are a number of people who have carried it on. We have a couple of colleagues in Copenhagen who developed a wonderful art installation that involves using a random number generator, a random event generator, to alternate a picture with a random noise background, and the viewer would attempt to make the picture emerge from the background. Another one in the Netherlands who has developed a program that takes the output of random event generators and converts it to musical notes. And as you listened to it, you would try to detect or create music.
Has the military picked up on any of this?
Oh, we've had visits over the years from people from the government, but we never, pardon me,
Sure.
we never accepted any government funding. We insisted that anything we did had to be in the open literature.
Mm-hmm.
And our program then and now has always been supported by contributions, tax-deductible contributions from interested people and philanthropists and so forth. So, yeah, I think the government has had an interest. They haven't really bothered us much except to occasionally stop by to find out what we were doing. And we haven't bothered them very much.
Well, that sounds like a wise decision. I wanted to...
Yeah, we weren't...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we were not interested in gaining notoriety or fame or money. I mean, we were doing this just for the sheer joy of learning something exciting and new. And as long as, we had enough support that we could maintain our staff, we had a staff of, it varied from maybe 5 to 8 people at different times, who came from different disciplines, from engineering, from physics, from psychology, from medicine, who all worked together in this very small space that we had carved out in the basement of the engineering school. I'm talking about PEAR now, not ICRL.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, in fact, there's another cute story I could tell you, and that is... when we first started the laboratory, we didn't have a name for the program. And I believe this is an anecdote that was in Molecular Memories.
Mm-hmm.
We thought we were being very clever by posting a Greek psi on the door. Psi is a term that's used, to represent psychology, to represent anomalous or psychic phenomena. It's also a very important symbol that is used in engineering and physics. It's at the center or the core of the Schrödinger equation. Okay, so we figured that there was some interesting correspondence there. We put this Greek psi on the door. And within a couple of weeks, we had 2 or 3 people come by and ask us with rather frightened looks on their faces why we had a devil's pitchfork on the door. We thought this was rather interesting, and from a psychological perspective, may be telling us more than they even meant to be telling us. Mm-hmm. But we took down the psi with a psi, and we put up a poster that had, you've probably seen these, it's a picture of a spiral galaxy with a little arrow that says, "You are here."
Oh, yeah.
Well, one day I came in the morning and there was some guy standing there staring at our door, and he looked at me accusingly and said, "That's not our galaxy." And I said, "Oh, thank you for pointing that out. I'd hate to have a misleading sign on the door." I ripped it off, went inside, and broke up laughing.
Yeah, that's good.
But shortly after that, Bob had suggested we really had to come up with a name for the program. And we went out to lunch one day, and we were sitting in this little cafe talking about it, and he said, "What do you think about the name Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research?" And I thought about it, and I said, PEAR, PEAR? Nah, that doesn't grab me. Meanwhile, the waitress came and brought our lunch, and Bob said, "Pass the salt," and I picked up the salt shaker, which turned out to be a pewter pear.
Oh, okay.
And I said, "Okay, no, I still don't like it." And when we finished our main course, the waitress came back and said, "Can I interest you folks in some dessert? We have some fresh pear cake."
Synchronicity.
And I said, "Okay, I can't win this one."
Synchronicity knocks.
So pear it became, and apparently having a picture of a pear on the door didn't seem to offend anyone.
Well, thank God.
But I think it gives an interesting perspective on the response and reactions of some of our academic colleagues and the community there, of the discomfort that they had with the program. And although, to its credit, the university permitted us to continue with it, they were very, very careful about oversight and making sure we didn't do anything or make claims that were outlandish or too sensational. I think, as Bob put it, they were worried about some of their alumni, their big funders getting embarrassed and they'd lose money. Although, curiously, most of our major supporters over the years were Princeton alumni.
Interesting.
James McDonald, Lawrence Rockefeller, Donald Webster, and one or two others, who supported us privately because they were interested in what we were doing.
Yeah, Lawrence Rockefeller is quite an interesting fellow from the point of view of anomalies research, since he's also been extremely interested in the study of UFOs. I point that out simply because many of our listeners are people who are interested in what are UFOs in general. So that is quite interesting. I want to bring you back for a minute to something that I think that some of our listeners who aren't of the engineering persuasion probably need a little more information on in a very non-technical way. You started to explain it, but could you go back to random number generators and random event generators and sort of explain, how they work and I understand they're still manufactured today by Celeron, I believe, which is an organization or a company that's sort of related to y'all there.
Yeah, they were. That was founded by some of our former colleagues and students. A random event generator and a random number generator are basically the same thing.
Okay.
It's just that we use the term random event generator because the devices that we used didn't technically generate numbers. They generated binary bits, ones and zeros. Okay?
Okay.
And you'd end up with a string of random digits, ones and zeros, 110, 1001,
Exactly.
coming off this thing. The output was recorded in a computer and on a printed tape record. And they were generated at varying speeds. Most of the data were generated at 1,000 bits per second. So they could generate a lot of data very rapidly. And the output of the random event generator, the noise source, was converted to, as I say, a string of bits, and that went through a series of processes that counted and displayed these counts in numerical form. Mainly what they were looking at was the sequences of ones and zeros, which should have been random, to see how many times these bits conformed to a regular alternation of 10, 10, 10. Okay?
Okay.
Now, if by chance you would expect about 50% of the time to be that it would match. And so let's say you had generated 1,000 of these bits, you would expect a number of, I'm sorry.
Sort of like 500 of one, 500 of the other?
No, it looked at 100. It looked at strings of 100, of 200 of these bits.
Okay.
Forgive me, it's been a couple of years.
Okay, not a problem.
Yeah. So it would look at a string of 200 bits, where it would expect 100 matches to the ones and zeros, and by chance you'd expect a count of 100. And people would look at these numbers coming out at about 1 per second, and attempt to get more numbers that were over 100, or more numbers that were under 100, or to just let it generate as baselines. And what we discovered was over many, many trials, there were more numbers above 100 when people were trying to get high numbers and more numbers below when they were trying to get low numbers. The effects were quite small, but over many, many trials, they turned out to be statistically very unlikely to have occurred by chance. Let me give you an example. Let's say you flipped 10 coins. By chance, you'd expect to get 5 heads, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
If you got 6 heads, you wouldn't be overly impressed. But let's say you flipped that coin 100 times and you got 60 heads. Well, that was still only 1 extra head, but it was happening too often.
Mm-hmm.
When you did this 1,000 times or 10,000 times and you got 6,000 heads, then you were looking at something that was very unlikely. Something was going on there. You couldn't look at any individual number and tell that it was an anomalous number. The anomaly appeared to be statistical in nature. That is, it was as if, I'm not saying this is what happened, but it would be as if somehow or other the consciousness of the operator was inserting some component of organization into this random process, making it just a little less random than it should have been.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mention this because as a result of that small effect size that showed up only statistically over many, many events, and other factors that we discovered, for example, the fact that men and women operators tended to produce different patterns of results.
Interesting.
We also found that when we had 2 people working together, if the 2 participants were opposite sex, they were getting results that were about 2.5 times larger than either of them would get individually. If they were of the same sex, the results tended to be just a chance.
Huh.
If the opposite sex pairs were a couple, their results tended to be even stronger, something like 7 times as large as what they would get individually. So again, this question comes up, what in the world would gender have to do with this? A few other things were involved there, but it led us to a hypothesis that we, in fact, we're working on a book on this topic, that possibly what we're looking at here that we're calling consciousness is nothing more than the life force itself, the process that underlies evolution. Mm-hmm. Evolution is a small effect that is driven by a small alteration of otherwise random processes, genetic recombination and so forth. Uh-huh. It's also something where having a male-female input seems to enhance the process.
One thinks.
Anyway, this is a very interesting area of exploration because most of the people who have looked at consciousness have tended to look at it either from the point of view of psychology or the point of view of physics, okay? Except that what's going on here involves non-local effects, both in the remote perception and in the human-machine experiments, where people could be miles or even hundreds of miles away from the machines and still get the same effects. They could even be thinking about the process hours or even days before or after the machine was running. It was clearly a non-local process that was not associated with the brain of the person sitting in front of the machine. The fact that it was non-local defied the primary tenet of physics, namely that effects should fall off with distance. They should get weaker as you got further away.
Yes.
and these results were challenging these rules of physics, the rules of psychology, and it led us to think, well, if it's not physics and it's not psychology, maybe it's something that lies in the area of biology, namely evolution. Okay, or as I said, the life force, the élan vital, as Bergson called it. So, anyway, did I explain the process? Do you understand?
Yes, you
well.
did. And I have...
No, I was going to say a lot of interesting footnotes as well.
Yes. I have two kind of questions, corollary questions, and we had a gentleman on here who I know named Dr. Ross Dunseith, who seems to be doing some similar experiments down at DOPS under the subheading of like micro PK, and so how do you feel about that? That's the first question, and the second question is having to do with bringing these random number generators out to events, which I believe is something that Dr. Roger Nelson, who was expected to be a future guest on Shattered Reality, the wonderful Dr. Roger Nelson. He brought these random number generators out to events and saw a statistical anomalies there. So I wonder if you could talk to either of those two subjects.
Well, the first question, I'm not familiar with that gentleman's work, but I know there are a lot of people who are doing that kind of work and finding very similar results. So although I can't speak pro or con to his particular studies, I'm delighted to know that there are people, doing that. As far as the other, this is also a very interesting aspect of the PEAR program. When our participants did their thing and we'd ask them, what they were feeling and experiencing, most of them said, although what you're studying here is the effect of intention, there's more than just having an intention that's going on here. One has to be resonant with the machine. One has to have an emotional connection, much in the way a musician might have an emotional relationship with his or her instrument, the way a race car driver has a bond with his car. And so forth, that this emotional thing was important to them. And we said, well, it's very difficult to study, emotion in a controlled protocol in the laboratory. But what we could do was we could build these portable random event generators that could be taken out into the field. We call this experiment field reg. Field REG, which has a double entendre, the field being, out in the field, and also being somehow picking up some kind of emotional field. And we would take these devices to different environments that might have a possibility of generating a strong emotional resonance among the participants. It might be a prayer meeting, it might be a meditation group, it might be a concert, but someplace where there's a group of people who are, if you will, all on the same wavelength. Most of us have experienced that kind of thing, or I hope we have. It's really quite a transcendent experience where you feel like you're just part of something bigger. You're no longer functioning as an individual, but as a collective. And we discovered that the random event generators, which were just running unobserved in the background, were producing more ordered outputs during these periods where people did have this subjective feeling of resonance, as opposed to when we brought it into more mundane environments, maybe a lecture hall or maybe a board meeting, or where nothing would show up. Now, Roger Nelson, who was working with us on this project, became very intrigued by this and wanted to take it further. And he developed this program he calls the Global Consciousness Network, which involves having random event generators situated all over the world, all over the planet. I think the last time I heard it was something on the order of 60 or 70 of these devices.
Wow.
All of which would be generating these random outputs continuously into a dedicated server. And then they would be time and date marked. And during periods of strong global emotion, there were significant, increases in or should we say decreases in the randomicity. Okay,
Right.
He's done this. He has some results. His global consciousness network. You can also look that up on the internet. And he describes hundreds of these trials with amazingly significant results. One of the more well-known one was the output that occurred just before and during the 9/11 attacks in New York, way back when. Princess Diana's funeral, the Barack Obama's election. There was none for the most recent election, to the best of my knowledge. That I don't think would you qualify as a resonant experience for most people.
Well, his work is really, really fascinating, and we are hoping to have him on at some time in the fall. I wanted to...
I think you'd find it, and I think your listeners would find it fascinating. It's really exciting stuff. But again, it's giving evidence for this non-local consciousness as an ordering principle.
Yes.
And that's the key to the whole thing as far as we're concerned. We're looking at some primordial ordering principle that affects life, at least, and probably all of nature in some way. I mean, if you're willing to concede that consciousness goes beyond just human experience.
Absolutely. My feeling entirely.
It would be interesting to run one of these experiments alongside artificial intelligence and see if that AI developed its own sense.
It would be interesting. I don't know of anyone who's doing that, but it would be a very interesting thing to study.
I know that Michio Kaku, I heard him recently speaking about how to tell if artificial intelligence had gained self-consciousness, and he was speaking about putting a bit into the brain or memory of this artificial intelligence that would shut it down if it started to have murderous thoughts about humans.
Well,
I thought that was rather novel.
I'm not familiar with that. My own feeling on that is I could go back to a quote by what's the guy who one of the early founders of computers, Alan Turing.
Alan Turing, yes.
Once was asked how you could tell whether an artificial intelligence, machine was conscious, and his response was, when you type in a statement and the machine comes back with, "That reminds me of a story." Mm-hmm. From my perspective and Dr. Jahn's, and based on what we have seen from our research, there's more than intention, there's more than a quantitative process going on here. There is this emotional component of resonance. And until a computer can develop that kind of emotional feature, I don't think it has any chance of having real intelligence.
Well, it's interesting
but again,
because
that's an opinion.
It's an opinion. There's also a theory in ufology too, where, for Bill and I used to kid around about the soul-sucking vampires from outer space, but that a lot of the little grays are supposedly just robotic android-type figures and really have no sense of being alive, and that's why they've come to Earth, and that's why they're studying humans. Like they just don't get it. They can tell you the frequency of the various shades of blue, but they can't tell
Right.
you why they like one shade over another. And
Right.
and-
They don't understand concepts like love
Yeah.
or beauty
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
joy.
And they say that
you
that's
know, these
right.
these are human and perhaps animal or even plant capabilities.
Oh,
I mean,
definitely on dogs
I mean,
and cats.
people
you see
talk
it.
to plants. That I know. I have a couple of pet cats.
Mm-hmm.
They communicate not only with each other but with me.
I know.
And I've had in our book. Let me turn for a moment to molecular memories. After we finished publishing Consciousness and the Source of Reality, a number of our friends and colleagues said, you've written some good books describing your research, but nobody will ever understand the real essence underlying the PEAR research unless they understand the strange and wonderful dynamic between you and Bob Jahn. You really ought to write a book about that. And that was what we did a year or two ago. It's a book that has, it was a wonderful book to write. It has no equations, no tables, it has some fun pictures.
Yes,
but
it does.
basically, it's the story of two people who really come from almost two different universes, okay? Very little in common in the ordinary sense of the term, but who shared a vision, who respected and, learned from each other, and how somehow or other in the dynamic between the two of us, much as in, a molecular configuration where you have two separate atoms, that when they come together and form a molecule, it turns out that the molecule has different characteristics than the individual atoms. I mean, look at water. It's made up of oxygen and hydrogen, but no matter how hard you look at oxygen or hydrogen, you're not going to come up with water. There's something that's going on here that unifies, that in the relationship, the dynamic of the interaction, something special and unique happens. And we also used to joke that Bob and I were almost like a example of the wave-particle duality.
Yes, I
He
love
was
that.
very-
I love
That's
that.
Yeah, he was very much the particle. He was very precise about position and time and quantitative measurement, and basically, I mean, he was an engineer, okay, and a physicist. I was not. I was more of a molecule. And just as a particle deals with position and momentum, a wave deals with resonance, with frequencies and amplitudes. So I'm good at frequencies and amplitudes, but I get lost.
Well,
but it is really, again, this complementarity of the two of us that made the program what it was. And the book describes a number of interesting anecdotes and little stories about our adventures together.
It's a wonderful book.
Including, I might add, some wonderful experiences we had in interactions with animals. And but I can't, tell you or your listeners all the stories in the book, but it's a fun read.
It is a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. I just want to mention that. I do highly recommend the book. I wanted to
What is the title? That's molecular.
Molecular
it is
Memories.
Molecular Memories.
Here
I
we
thought it
have
was
it
a
right here
different-
on the table.
No, I thought it was a different book in addition to that.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, it was published by the ICRL Press, and that and all of our books are available online through either Amazon or Barnes and Noble. So as I say, you can go to icrl.org, look up, click on ICRL Press and look at the whole list of books, and you can order them from there. But they describe, give a little description of what the books are. As for me, at this point in my life, I'm kind of glad to be out of the science business, and I'm very much enjoying being in the publishing business.
Great.
It's really, it's a whole new thing for me, and a chance to learn, from many different perspectives, different voices, and looking at different ways of looking at reality, and looking for the commonalities across all of these different domains. So, as I say, that's where I'm at in this era of my life now that we've retired from PEAR.
I just want to say what a wonderful thrill it was for me to meet you and Dr. Robert Jahn for the first time at the recent SSE Symposium up in Yale, which is where I made your acquaintance. And so at this, and you gave an address for the Founders Award, which was given to Dr. Jahn.
That was last year, and this year they gave it to me.
They gave it to you. I'm sorry, I got confused there.
Yeah. Well, let me put in a little plug, if I may, for the Society for Scientific Exploration.
Absolutely.
Or SSE. And again, their website is scientificexploration.org. But SSE was established not long after PEAR was by a handful of scholars who were interested in topics that lay outside of traditional science, and who were finding a very skeptical or negative response to their interests among their colleagues. They were having difficulty. These were people who were interested in things like psychic phenomena, UFOs, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, reincarnation, homeopathy. It's a whole broad range of topics. Cryptozoology, the search for Bigfoot and
Sure.
Loch Ness and such. And they decided that since they could not get a hearing from their professional colleagues, they would start their own organization. So SSE became a professional society for the presentation and sharing of research that was going on in these fields that lay sort of outside the mainstream. The society, I'm not quite sure. I think this last meeting was something like its 35th annual meeting. But both Bob and I were active from the beginning in SSE, helping to organize meetings. We have a journal, the Journal of Scientific Exploration, that comes out quarterly. It's a referee journal that presents good research in many of these renegade, heretical areas. And it's very interesting. It also publishes a magazine called Edge Science that's not quite as technical, but has some interesting essays on topics of this sort. Alternative energy. I can't even think of all the topics, but if you can think of a topic that's outside the mainstream, it's inside SSE.
Indeed, it is.
And SSE encourages people to join as members or associates, so that you get a subscription to the journal, invitations to the meetings. And as you probably gathered from your own experience, these meetings are fascinating. Not only are the presentations interesting and stimulating, but the dynamic is wonderful. You have a bunch of outcasts, if you will, who come together and huddle for warmth with others, who have experienced that kind of rejection. And it lends itself to a very warm community. it's always good to go, and see one's friends.
Absolutely.
As I observed in my talk this year, it's great to see, familiar faces, although so many of them have now been gray as the years have gone by, myself included. But it is a great organization, and for people interested in topics such as those you cover in your broadcasts, I think this would be a society that they might be interested in joining.
Absolutely.
So anyway, that's my plug.
Good. You don't have to plug it to us personally, because both Kate Valentine and myself are associate members of the SSE.
Good.
And we have, as you may know from the flyer which I gave you at the SSE, that we have had any number of SSE members as guests already, and plan to have more. We're going to.
If you haven't approached William Bankston, who is the president of SSE, he might be an interesting person to talk to. Also, he has done some incredible research on healing, with particularly using mice and using no medication or anything, just through pure consciousness. Been able to cause cancers to disappear. What's the word I'm looking for?
The total remission?
Remission.
Remiss. Thank you.
Dr. Bankston is a very, very interesting person, and certainly known to us, and we will certainly consider that idea. And we do have coming up, we hope, Dr. Roger Nelson and Dr. Ed Kelly, two other members. But we're going to have to wind it down for today. But before we go, I had asked you beforehand if you wanted to stick around for the story that I wanted to tell about what happened to me prior to this recent SSE meeting up in Yale, and then during a little walk we took. So if you don't mind, I'm going to tell that story right now. And
I'd be delighted to hear it.
Okay. What happened?
But let me at least say, since we're going to move on to another topic, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share some of my experiences with your listeners, and to invite me to participate in this program. And it's just a pleasure for me, and it's a pleasure to get to know you.
Well, thank you so much.
I was going to say,
our pleasure.
Yeah, really, thank you.
Our honor to have you on the program. In any case, just briefly to. Oh dear, we have a sound here.
That's okay.
It's okay.
It's not an EVP. It's just a phone.
It's just a phone. Okay. So prior to attending the meeting at Yale, I was in Rhode Island. And the last night that I was in Rhode Island, I had a dream. And in my dream, I was walking down a curved sidewalk or a path, a path that was fairly well traversed, not a path in the woods. And it was a curved path, and I was walking down this path, and somebody was standing on my left side, slightly behind me. And I saw a woman with a little dog in my dream. And this woman, was walking the dog toward me, and I said to my companion, who was on the left, slightly behind me, "Gee, that dog looks like a miniature German Shepherd, and I wonder if that's the kind of dog I should get." And that was kind of the beginning and the end of the dream. The light was golden. There was a friend on my right side. I did say on my left, on my right side. And I made this comment about a miniature German Shepherd. And I thought about this dream and thought how unusual it was. And I made note of it because I keep a dream diary. Well, the next night was my first night at the Yale facility, and I had reason to call up my my co-conspirator, Miss Kate Valentine here, and because we often talk about animals. We're both animal lovers, and I've spoken to her before about how much I'd like to have a dog, and so I said to her, I told her about my dream, and I said that I thought she might have been the person on my right behind me because of the fact we always talk about dogs. Well, her comment to me was that as far as she knew, there was no miniature German Shepherd, but there were a lot of nice mixed breed dogs who might look like a miniature German Shepherd. And I said, hey, Kate, that's cool. And we moved on to other stuff. But I did explain to her my dream in...
Yes. Oh, yeah. I verify it.
Okay, good. So then the day after that night, I was at the Yale dining hall dining with a group of people who included my friend Mike Turner, who also had part in the experiments that Dr. Bill Bankston made with the mice, et cetera. I think he did some form of statistical analysis and so forth. I'm not quite clear. But Dr. Bankston came over to Mike and said, would you mind walking over to the next location, which was kind of far away from the dining hall, and everybody was confused as to the maps and so forth. And he said, would you mind walking over with Brenda Dunne and Bob Jahn, Dr. Bob Jahn, to the next the location so that they get there on time and that everybody goes where they should go. So the four of us proceeded to walk across one of the main streets in New Haven, where Yale is located, with Michael Turner on my right side, just slightly behind me, and Brenda Dunne and Bob Jahn walking just slightly behind, when along comes this lady with a little dog down a curved sidewalk towards me and my walker friends, and it was just the most beautiful little puppy. And when it finally reached us, I think somebody, might have been me, said, what kind of a dog is that? To which the young woman replied, it is an miniature Australian Shepherd. And all of a sudden, it became clear to me that my dream had pretty much been realized in real life. And since I didn't really know anything about an Australian Shepherd or a miniature Australian Shepherd, my monkey mind translated that into a miniature German Shepherd. And I was ecstatic over the fact that both you, Brenda, and Dr. Jahn seemed to be very entranced by the dog, and I realized that the two of you were both dog lovers, and so I realized I was amongst my kind of people.
Yeah, I remember the event quite clearly because it was the very friendly little puppy that came up and wanted to, to be petted and attention, and it was wagging its tail like crazy, and we were all oohing and eyeing over it.
Yes, indeed.
So
that's my
little... Did you get...
Go ahead.
Did you get an Australian Shepherd?
No, I haven't gotten a dog yet. I don't think that I probably would get a pedigree dog unless it was a rescue. I'm more the rescue type in terms of my many cats and my occasional dog. I haven't gotten a dog yet because it doesn't seem to be the right time. But I will certainly look for a lovely dog when I'm able to get one.
But you talk about...
I might mention that over the years I have gotten countless stories from people about similar things, dreams that happened just as they were dreamt, precognitive experiences that then came about just as they had been envisioned. People have asked me, can you explain this? And, my typical answer is, I can't explain it. What I can tell you is, based on my experience, it's far more common than most people would think.
Yeah. But you know too,
the-
you were talking about emergent psychology, like with random number generators. I mean, you even take a look at dogs. A dog will react certainly one way. A pack of dogs reacts a whole different way. So you know, you do get that
Yeah.
overlapping.
Well, if I have another moment,
Oh,
I don't know if
absolutely.
this is still on the air, but we actually had a friend, also a member of SSE, who used to have a number of raccoons who lived in the woods behind her house. And they would come up to the porch, her back porch, and she'd put out peanuts for them. And she once said to me, you know, those raccoons are so clever, and they will do just about anything to get peanuts.
I'll
And
bet.
I said to her, anything? And she looked at me, and I looked at her. We developed a little, based on an old gumball dispenser, hooked up to a random event generator,
Oh my
which
goodness.
was filled
funny.
with peanuts.
That's good.
And it turned out, it never really went too far because she ended up with some technical problems with the device. But in the meantime, over the time that she had, she said that it was really astounding how these raccoons would come up and they each would have their own technique. For example, one would put its paws on the machine and then step back and wait for it to dispense peanuts. Another one would walk around it and then come to the front, wait for it to dispense. And another one, which I thought was a riot, said would look at the machine, turn its back, and walk to the edge of the porch as if it was ignoring it, and then stop and look over its shoulder.
Oh boy, I like that one.
But yes, I think experiments along these lines with animals would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
They are so much better than we are at pure perception, you know, without all the monkey mind getting in the way.
Right. The
And
thinking
I
process.
suspect the results could be very interesting.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful idea for some budding young scientist from the SSE group to work on, and we can put it out there for them. I'm afraid the time has come at this juncture where we need to say
Adieu.
Adieu. Auf Wiedersehen.
Yeah.
Sayonara.
But thank you so much. It was a
Thank
really
you, yes.
fascinating discussion. I appreciate your spending this time with us.
Thank you so much, Brenda Dunne, a former lab director at PEAR and current publisher for ICRL. Thank you so much for participating with us.
It was my pleasure.
Okay.
So that's the end of another
It's time to say goodbye from
Shattered Reality.
Okay, good. Really is a fount of knowledge.
What was it?